Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, In Defense of Skepticism, How to Believe Nothing, Doubt Certain Knowledge, Dismantle Dogmatists, Avoid Contradictions, Eschew Error, and Never Fall on the Wrong Side of the Burden of Proof. Again. In this video, we're going to be looking at a couple different types of skepticism. This is going to be more kind of a historical video where we're going to be looking at the Pyrrhonian skepticism and the academic skepticism that are out there. Those are generally the two kinds of skepticism that you will see. They are a little bit different, but often complement each other, and their arguments complement each other in powerful ways. In this video, I'll be outlining kind of what they held or didn't believe, who they were, and some of the main arguments for each of them. But first, let's get to the main distinction between Pyrrho and the academics. There is a claim out there which is that knowledge is possible. Of this claim, you can either hold that it is true, it is false, or it is unknown. The dogmatists, or the epistemists, epistemology, study of knowledge, epistemist, someone that believes in knowledge, hold that it's true, that knowledge is possible, and often hold that they know certain things. The academic skeptics hold that it is false that knowledge is possible. They say that knowledge is impossible, that we cannot know things. The Pyrrhonian skeptics hold that it's unknown as to whether or not knowledge is possible. The Pyrrhonian skeptics even go so far as to consider the academic skeptics dogmatists, because they make a certain claim, whereas the Pyrrhonians just leave it open and leave it unknown. In this video, I'm going to go through each of these positions and some arguments for them. First off, the academics. The academics argue for the claim that we don't know anything. They argue for the negatively dogmatic claim that we know nothing. They use things like the duplication argument. They kind of have a Cartesian skepticism, even though they were long before Descartes. Descartes kind of modeled the skeptic that he was in dialogue with after the academics. And they say that knowledge requires that we eliminate all doubt. Some important academics were Arcesilaus, Carneades, of course, Clitomachus, Philo of Larissa, Antiochus, and Cicero. So far, I've only made a video on Carneades. Hopefully in the future, I will make some more videos on the other famous skeptics of history. But you can definitely check them out online. Check them out on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It has some great information. Now we're going to take a look at some of the arguments presented by the academics. The most powerful argument, and the arguably most convincing one, though it's a little more philosophically dense than the others, is the argument from closure. It relies on something known as the closure principle, which is basically, for all x and for all y, if x implies y, and s is justified in believing x, that implies that s is justified in believing y. Basically, where x and y are propositions, x is a subject, s is basically like a person or a thinking thing, whatever you think is the kind of thing that knows things or believes things, or is justified in believing things. And J is the relation such that JSX stands for S is justified in believing X. Once again, the closure principle, which seems fairly intuitive, is that for all propositions X and Y, if X entails Y, and S is justified in believing X, then S is justified in believing Y. Basically, if you're justified in believing some claim out there, and that claim logically entails some other claim, then you are justified in believing that other claim. Okay? So, the closure argument goes as follows. If I'm justified in believing that there's a hand in front of my face, then I'm justified in believing that it's not the case that I'm in some skeptical scenario where I don't have hands don't exist, or my hands are behind my back. Insert your favorite skeptical scenario in there for SK. Number 2, I'm not justified in believing that it's not the case that I'm in some skeptical scenario. Therefore, I'm not justified in believing that there's a hand in front of my face. Basically, the first claim is kind of a version of the closure principle, or an instantiation of the closure principle. having a hand in front of my face entails that it is not the case that I'm not in a skeptical scenario. So if I'm justified in believing that there's a hand in front of my face, I'm justified in believing that I'm not in a skeptical scenario. I'm not justified in believing that I'm not in a skeptical scenario because the duplication argument can show you that the skeptical scenario and the scenario you think you're in may look and appear to be perfectly identical in every way. And in fact, every piece of evidence you get for being in that scenario you think you're in is also evidence for being in that skeptical scenario. So you're not justified in believing that it's not the case that SK. Therefore, just simply via modus tollens, you're not justified in believing that H. And if you're not justified in believing that there's a hand in front of your face when you're holding a hand up in front of your face, you don't seem to be justified in believing much anything. There are a couple of objections to the closure principle that we're going to look at that are going to kind of just refine our understanding of the closure principle and will be easily responded to. So first off, false propositions entail necessary truths. Simply because you believe some propositions, however, doesn't mean you're justified in believing all necessary truths. Basically, necessary truths are going to be entailed by anything. You can set up that entailment because they're always going to be true. If you're curious why that is, you should check out my video on implication. The simple response to this is that we just limit the scope of closure to contingent truths, which will get rid of all of those problems. As long as we limit the scope of closure to contingent truths, the problem isn't going to arise. So, let the closure principle be for all contingent propositions x and y, so on and so forth. The next objection to the closure principle is that we need to make a distinction between actually held beliefs that one is justified in believing and beliefs that one is simply justified in believing. I can be justified in believing something but not assent to it. Just because we believe P, and it is some fact that P entails Q, it doesn't follow that we believe Q. The response to this, of course, is to very specifically define J as justified in believing, but not necessarily believed. It's just very clear how we're articulating our principle of closure. All right, now we're going to move on to the other main argument that the academics are going to offer. I'm going to call it a Cartesian argument, even though this is kind of a little anachronistic, because Descartes, of course, came after the academics, but he honestly did a better job of offering this argument than many of them did. Before we get to the argument, we need to take a look at the idea of genuine grounds for doubt, or grounds for doubt. Some proposition D is a grounds for genuine doubt of P, another proposition, for S, a subject, once again, a person or mind or whatever you think believes things, if and only if. 1. If D were added to S's beliefs, assent to P would no longer be adequately justified. Basically, D would somehow defeat the justification for P. 2. S is not justified in denying D. And 3. S has no way to neutralize D. Let's see what that looks like. So, it's going to culminate in something called the eliminate all doubt principle. For all propositions X and D, if D satisfies condition 1 of what we had previously, basically, adding D to S's beliefs would cause X to be unjustified. Then, if assenting to X is adequately justified for S, then S must be justified in eliminating D via either condition 2 or 3, denying or neutralizing it. Basically, in other words, if S can't eliminate their doubt by denying or neutralizing that doubt, there is no way that S can be justified in holding any belief. We'll also put into this the untrustworthiness thesis, which is my epistemic equipment is untrustworthy. If you're curious for a justification of that, check out the various skeptical scenarios. Descartes' favorite was the evil deceiver, but there's many more. The Matrix. Brain into that, as you will. So the argument goes as follows. If I know that P, then there are no genuine grounds for doubting that P. U is genuine ground for doubting that P. In fact, U is genuine ground for doubting pretty much anything. Therefore, I do not know that P. Now we're going to move on to the Pyrrhonians. The Pyrrhonians, on the other hand, did not assent to non-evident propositions. how we define non-evident and evident propositions is pretty important. But we'll leave that for now because it's a matter of dispute. The Pyrrhonians use things like Agrippa's trilemma, or Munchausen's trilemma, which you've seen if you've checked out my video on Agrippa versus presuppositionalism, or Munchausen's trilemma. We're going to cover it a little bit in this video as well. In order to argue against the dogmatists, they claimed, in fact, that the academics were just as dogmatic as the epistemists, because the academics argued for the negatively dogmatic conclusion that we can't know things, or knowledge is impossible. The Pyrrhonians basically said that debates can't be decided, as both arguments are eventually going to be equally strong, or you can build up arguments on both sides such that we would be in such a state that we could not decide between them. Let's take a look at some of the people that were Pyrrhonians. Of course, there was Pyrrho, arguably the first skeptic. Check out my video on Pyrrho versus presuppositionalism for a little bit more information on him. Pyrrho's student, Timon, who copied down a lot of the things that Pyrrho said, Anaxidemus, Agrippa, and Sextus Empiricus. If you're interested in a lot of information on Pyrrhonism, Sextus Empiricus is going to be the best place to go. Check out his outlines of Pyrrhonism for a lot of information, a lot of good arguments, and a lot of kind of a more stable or powerful position in defense of Pyrrho and those beliefs, because Pyrrho himself, as well as many of these other skeptics here, didn't write that much, or didn't document that much. So, on to the arguments. The 5 modes are an important argument for the Pyrrhonian skeptics. You have mode 1, disagreement. There's some disagreement as to whether something is the case or not. If there's disagreement, you can't be justified in holding one view over the other because other people disagree with you or other people have an equally strong argument. Infinite regress. You might claim that a justified claim is justified via an infinite regress, but clearly that doesn't make sense. Relativity. The claim that everything is relative, or that our perception is person relative or relative to a specific situation we're in. And just because it's relative, it doesn't say anything about the way that things actually are. It says more something about our perception, so we can't make claims about the way things actually are. Hypothesis, a claim is justified with no argument to support it. It's supposedly justified on its own. And circularity, the claim is justified by a claim that's in turn supported by that original claim. Now, focusing down on 2, 4, and 5, we see that this is just Munchausen's trilemma. What I'm going to do here is offer some arguments against the foundationalist and the coherentist, because I haven't run into someone who's an infinitist in a long time. So let's take a look. Against the foundationalists. Imagine we have 2 people discussing back and forth. Fred, the foundationalist, and Polly, the Pyrrhonist. Fred says, I have some basic belief, B, that justifies itself. Polly says, what grounds do you have for believing that B is true? Fred can only say nothing other than B's own autonomous warrant. Anything else is going to make him a coherentist or mean that B isn't a basic belief. Polly could respond, well, are propositions with autonomous warrant the kind of things that are more likely to be true? Here's an interesting problem for Fred. If he says that yes, they are, then that belief that propositions with autonomous warrant are the kind of things that are more likely to be true is actually going to be what underlies and what defines and what justifies or warrants his belief in B. So B is not going to be a basic belief, and rather, that belief is going to be a basic belief. So he has to say, no. The problem here, of course, is Polly's then going to say, then your belief is arbitrary as you don't claim that it's in any way connected to truth. It's just arbitrarily justified in some way that doesn't make sense in our understanding of justification. Now, we also have a way to respond to the coherentist. It's important to note there are 2 different kinds of coherentism. There is warrant transfer coherentism, which claims that beliefs pass around warrant in a circle. I realize right now I'm using warrant and justification kind of interchangeably. They are different. At some point I will make a video explaining the difference. For now, just go with it. And warrant emergent coherentism, which claims that warrant is achieved from kind of a web-like structure of mutually consistent propositions, and that warrant just kind of eventually emerges out of those propositions. Now, the argument against the warrant transfer coherentist goes as follows. Basically, what they're going to say is that belief can be passed around in a circle, or that the justification for a belief can just pass around in a circle, and that'll be okay, and it'll make the whole circle warranted. We might go from, there's liquid on the ground, and that's water. Therefore, it rained last night. It rained last night, and that's why the liquid on the ground is water. The problem is, according to Aristotle, this is simply a way of proving anything. The liquid on the ground is not water. Well, why? Because it didn't rain last night, and there'd be no other place for that to come from. So, it must not be water, it must be something else. Therefore, the liquid on the ground is not water. In fact, you can prove any claim with this kind of system, so it's not going to be a very good system. So, that would be a great objection to the warrant transfer coherentist. Now, the warrant emergent coherentist is a more popular position, and this says that warrant is achieved from kind of a web-like structure of mutually consistent propositions. The problem is that this is going to devolve back into foundationalism, which we've already objected to, as in order for the proposition to enter the web in the first place, it must have some autonomous bit of warrant, or it must be justified by some specific proposition that is the proposition that decides whether or not beliefs get into the web or not. And then the web isn't justified based on its coherence with each other, it is justified in relation to that specific proposition, and that proposition requires its own justification and is therefore a foundationalist picture. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at my personal take on skepticism, which is going to be a little bit closer to Pyrrho than any of the academics, but is going to definitely be a skepticism all its own. It's going to be called indirect skepticism. Watch this video and more at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.
Hello there. This is Pyrrho of Ellis. I hope you enjoyed that last video. If you did, check out one of these other videos from Carneades.org or subscribe to Carneades.org on YouTube. And remember, kids, stay away from non-evident propositions.